Hi, I'm Liz Reichman, a docent at the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio. This is the second part of a two-part lecture about women in the Holocaust. In part one, I discussed the theoretical aspects of the topic. Why study women in the Holocaust? And what were some of the main differences between men's and women's experiences during the event? In this second part, I'd like to explore the stories of 4 Polish Jewish women who survived the Holocaust and immigrated to Israel. Their stories will demonstrate some of the differences between men's and women's experiences. These are the differences that we isolated in the first lecture. The women's stories will illustrate all of these differences except for the last one. The stories don't really illustrate a fear of sexual violence. I'll give you a chance to review these quickly and tell you a little bit more about the women. The 4 women are all from Białystok, Poland. 3 of them were sisters, and one of them was my mother-in-law, Zena Reichman. Zena was born in 1923 in Białystok. Her father, Itzhak, was a wealthy textile merchant, and her mother, Fega, was a housewife. If you'd asked Xena about her childhood, she would have told you it was idyllic. She had 2 older sisters. She attended the local public school. Her family was secular, a very non-observant family. She had lots of friends, both Jewish and Christian. She was one of the top students in her class. She excelled at math, and she had a real affinity for languages. At home, they spoke Yiddish and Polish, and she learned Polish at school. She also learned German and Russian, and she was so adept at those 2 languages that even decades later, people would mistake her for a native speaker. Xena would have told you her childhood was idyllic except for one thing, that her mother made her eat spinach for dinner. If you'd asked her about herself, she would have told you that she was a proud Polish citizen, a patriot. Chopin was her favorite composer, and she loved to read Polish poets and authors. She didn't talk about her wartime experience. We knew she was an Auschwitz survivor because she had a tattoo on her arm, but she never talked about her experience. We thought we knew about it. We thought that she'd been hidden during the war and then had been betrayed, and that's why she had ended up in the camp, although later during the war than we'd expected, but we didn't really know. After she died in 2011, my husband was curious about his family history. He wanted to find out more, and he wanted to record it for our children and for their children. He commissioned a book to be written, and he hired a researcher and a writer, an Israeli woman, Hashem, and went to find out about Zena's life. What she discovered was very different from what we suspected. This is a picture of the book that we self-published for our family and friends. We also have a version in Hebrew for what it's worth. Zena's story was very different from what we expected. In 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland. They didn't occupy Białystok, not yet, because recall there'd been a deal between Hitler and Stalin that divided Poland in 2. Part of it he would get, part of it Stalin would get. Białystok fell in the part that Stalin controlled. So until 1941, Zena's life didn't change that much. But in 1941, the Nazis rolled in. They occupied the rest of Poland and pushed on into the Soviet Union as part of Operation Barbarossa. Xena and her family and the other Jews in Białystok were forced to live in a ghetto, an enclosed area in the city. They had to leave behind their homes and most of their possessions. Now Xena, because she was young and strong and had an affinity for languages, was chosen to be one of 10 girls who worked on a farm outside of the ghetto. A German officer had taken over the farm of a wealthy Polish citizen, and he was living there and using it. And so he needed people to work on the farm and to keep house for him. Xena was one of the people chosen. This made her life a little easier. She had better rations on the farm. The farm had plum trees and apple trees, so when the fruit was in season, she was able to pick some, stuff it in her pockets, eat a little bit for herself, and during the times that she was able to sleep at the ghetto with her parents, to bring some of the fruit home. Xena was a dog lover, so she quickly volunteered to take care of the commander's dog. He fed the dog table scraps, which was another opportunity for her. She could give a handful of table scraps to the dog and keep a handful of table scraps for herself or for her family. Now, her conditions were a little better, but don't misunderstand me. She was still a slave laborer on a farm. She was able to work on the farm until 1943, and then her situation changed again. In 1943, the Nazis were not doing as well in the war and had decided to liquidate the ghettos and to send all the Jews either to extermination camps like Treblinka, or if they were healthy and able to work camps like Auschwitz. Xena was sent to another smaller camp called Stutthof. Here we have a map of the different places she was during the war, beginning in Bialystok and then moving to Stutthof. Her parents were sent to Treblinka, a death camp, and she was sent to Stutthof. For 2 months she was there, sorting potatoes, she recalled, and that was the time when she knew true hunger. After being at Stutthof for 2 months, she was sent to Auschwitz. And for the next year, she worked in a weapons and munitions factory. In 1945, the Nazis were losing the war, and they began to destroy and evacuate the concentration camps. Treblinka, for example, was completely razed and buried under meters of dirt. In Auschwitz, the Nazis marched the prisoners out into German borders. For example, Xena was marched from Auschwitz to Ravensbrück, a journey I think of about 60 kilometers. It was winter and there was snow everywhere. And she recalled that there was snow all around her. Snow to eat, snow to drink, nothing but snow. She was liberated by the Soviet troops in 1945, and she weighed only 88 pounds. So I tell you all this about Xena's travels, and I tell you some details after telling you that she never talked about her wartime experience. How do I know all this? How do I know there were plum trees on the farm, and how do I know that she lived on the leftovers that were for the dogs? I know because Xena made a friend during her wartime experience. During that first ghetto experience, which she was sent to work on the farm, she met a young woman named Cilla. And Cilla did tell her story. Xena and Cilla managed to stay together throughout the war. So Xena's story and Cilla's story were the same. They were together at the farm, they were together at Stutthof, together at Auschwitz, together on the death march, together during liberation. Cilla did tell her story. She gave a testimony to Yad Vashem. And so the researcher was able to read that story and find out what happened to Xena. Women, interestingly enough, they both ended up in Haifa in Israel. This is probably 1959, 1960, looking at the ages. Xena is the one on the far right, and Itzhak, named after Zena's father, my husband, looks like he's 2 or 3 years old, so it's probably 1959, 1960. And Cilla is there with her 2 children. I like to point out that the daughter in the picture grew up to be an engineering professor at the Technion, Israel's MIT. Their story illustrates an example of the difference in experiences between men and women. Xena found a friend. Remember, this was one of the strategies, the differences that women had in how they survived, that often they would band together in groups, or they would form a tight friendship, and 1 or 2 women would look after each other and would get through the war that way. Xena and Cilla's story is an excellent example of that they took care of each other during the entire war. The next story is of Sonia, the middle sister. She was about 6 or 7 years older than Xena, and her story is the exception that proves the rule. Sonia escaped. She was not sent into the ghetto, and she was not sent into a camp because she immigrated to Israel in 1935. In those days, it was Palestine. And we don't know the details of exactly how it happened. We know she was a member of a youth group. Youth groups were a big deal for young people growing up at that time in Poland and Germany, but also during the war. These youth groups ended up being organizations that organized people, that motivated people when Jews were in the ghettos. For example, they published newspapers, newsletters, they put on plays, and when there were uprisings and resistance, they were typically organized by the youth groups. We'll hear more about one of those stories in a moment. But Sonia was a member of a youth group, and she immigrated to Israel, then known as Palestine. She ended up marrying and had several children. The third sister is the oldest sister, Luba. She was about 13 years older than. In 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, she was married and had a young child, named Dov, who was just a baby. I try to put myself in her shoes and imagine how scary it must have been to be a young mother, a young Jewish mother in Poland when the Nazis invaded. How would you keep your child safe? What would you do? Luba and her husband had a plan. Her husband escaped to the east, to the Soviet Union, and he was going to get a job and find a place to live and send for Luba and Dov once he was established. Unfortunately, that didn't happen before 1941. And when the Nazis came into Bialystok, Luba and her son Dov went into hiding. We don't know the details of their experience. We don't know if they were hidden in a special prepared space, an attic or a basement, the way Anne Frank was hidden, or if they hid in plain sight. It's possible that Luba also had gone to public school and also had good language skills, so it's possible she was able to pass as a Polish Christian woman. We don't know. I think it's surprising that we don't know, because remember that Dov was born in 1939, and he was liberated in 1945, so he would have been 6 years old. So we would assume he would have some memories of his wartime experiences, and yet he doesn't. He remembers nothing of the period when he was in hiding. But Luba and Dov were able to hide, and in 1945, when the war ended, they came back to Bialystok and tried to meet other members of their family. They found Xena, and Luba found her husband. It turned out that her husband, who'd fled to the east, didn't hear about her and Dov and assumed they'd been murdered. And so he had married and started another family. Now, we don't know exactly what was exchanged between the two of them, but we do know that that husband went back to the Soviet Union with his new family, and that Luba and Xena and Dov immigrated together to Israel. Here we see Luba pictured with her second husband, Arthur. The two of them had a daughter named Mickey, and she lived the rest of her life in Israel with her new husband and her two children. Luba's case illustrates a more typical example of Jewish life during the Holocaust. She had a husband, and he was sent to escape because he was going to be the economic anchor. He was young, he was healthy, he was going to carve out a new life for them and then send for his family to come join him. And she was a caregiver. She had a young child, which limited what she could do to protect herself. She had to think of her child first. So she didn't try to escape, and instead somehow found a way to hide and get through the war that way. The fourth example is not a relative, finally. This is Branca Kublansky, an excellent example of passing and resisting. Interestingly enough, she is another girl from Bialystok, born in the same year as my mother-in-law, but to a family with more modest economic circumstances. Until 1935, her family was poor. And finally, in 1935, they managed to scrape together enough money to open a kiosk in Bialystok. And finally, they were going to be middle class. The kiosk was destroyed by anti-Semitic thugs. And at that moment, 12-year-old Branca resolved that she was getting out of Poland. It was not a place for Jews. She joined a Jewish youth group, a Zionist group that was dedicated to getting Jews out of Poland into Palestine. Now, she didn't get out by 1941, and so her family and Branca were put into the Bialystok ghetto. Now, like Xena, She was young and strong and had an affinity for languages. And so she was chosen to work outside the ghetto. Her situation was not as comfortable as Zena's, however. She was sent to work outside. We don't know exactly where. But one story that I think illustrates the character of Branca, the chutzpah of Branca, is that even though she always claimed that she was just a rank and file member of Dror, the youth group she belonged to, she was the leader of a gang of girls that went out to work. And one day it was sleeting and cold, and she decided she was not going to work. It was too. So she told the gang not to show up and that she would deal with the Nazi officer that would take them out to work. So she showed up, and when he said that there was a rule that prevented them from working when the weather was this nasty, she said it with such conviction that he believed her. And that day, the work gang did not have to work in the sleet and snow. Branca had strawberry blonde hair and light-colored eyes and was good at speaking German and Polish. And so she was used as a courier, moving in and out of the ghetto during this time. She would smuggle weapons and food in and information out. She was so valuable as a courier that she was told, in fact, that in 1943, when the ghetto was about to be liquidated, that she should stay outside, that she needed to preserve herself. She'd smuggled in weapons, she'd smuggled in food. As a rank and file member, she was told that she needed to keep herself outside during the uprising. They knew it was going to be a suicide mission, and they probably wouldn't survive, but they wanted to make one more stand against the Nazis. And so this Jewish youth group, led by a bunch of young people, one young man in particular that Branca admitted later that she had sort of a crush on, rose up and were all murdered. So in 1943, Branca had lost her family that had been sent to Treblinka and all of her friends who had died in the uprising. She was heartbroken and left alone, but she was alive. And so she continued her mission. She continued to act as a spy and as a courier. And here we have another picture of her and a picture of the exceptionally good fake documents that she used in order to move around in this part of Europe. She continued to gather information and to pass it on to partisan groups. For example, she found out where an airfield was being built by the Nazis, and she managed to get information about it and about the kinds of planes that would be landing there and smuggled them to the Soviets so that they could bomb the airfield. One story she tells is that she was smuggling weapons to the partisans and was on a train, I suppose using her good papers, and a Nazi officer boarded. He was searching all the passengers to see what they had. Were they smuggling anything? Well, here was Branca with a suitcase full of weapons. She knew she'd be shot on sight, so she had to think fast. She decided to go to the Nazi officer, a young man, bat her eyes and admit to him that she was a smuggler, but not a smuggler of weapons, a smuggler of bread for her hungry family. She rearranged the bag so maybe a few loaves showed. And once again, the Nazi officer believed her and in fact invited her to ride in the front of the train with him to make sure that she wasn't harassed. At the end of the war, Branca too looked around for family, and finding that very few people had survived, she decided to immigrate to Israel. I don't think you'll be too surprised to learn that her first choice of occupation was to be an actress. Unfortunately, despite her exceptional skills, there wasn't much demand for young women who spoke Hebrew with strong Polish accent, and so she couldn't make a living as an actress. By 1955, she ended up as an archivist at Yad Vashem. She was gathering information about the Holocaust and its survivors, and gathering testimony about Jews' wartime experiences. She also became someone who told those stories. And the first story she told was the story of Dror, the youth group that had staged the uprising at Bialystok, and in particular, the story of that young man who had led Dror. And there we have it, the story of 4 young women from Bialystok, 4 different survival strategies, 4 different experiences during the Holocaust, and 4 different examples of how women experienced the Holocaust.